The message hit my phone at exactly 1:06 a.m., and the screen lit up the dark room with a cold white glow. "You are not family, Mom. My MIL says it is better if you do not come." I stared at the words Rachel sent me as if they were written in another language. Not family. The same daughter whose college fund I rebuilt after her father emptied it. The same daughter whose business I kept alive more times than she even remembers. The same daughter whose townhouse I saved from foreclosure just hours earlier with a transfer of $500,000. Yet the only sentence she chose for me in the middle of the night was "do not come." I opened the thread again, hoping the letters would shift into something kinder. They stayed sharp and deliberate. My throat tightened, but not enough to form a sound. Then her second text arrived. "Please do not make this toxic. Veronica wants a peaceful day." Toxic. My own child using that word to describe me while quoting her mother-in-law as if Veronica were the gatekeeper of all things pure. I did not argue. I did not ask why a woman who had known Rachel for 3 years had more authority over the wedding guest list than the mother who raised her for 31. I typed one word, "noted." My thumb hovered a moment before pressing send. No explanation, no plea, no justification. The house returned to silence except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat still in the dark, letting the glow of the phone fade until the room swallowed me again. A strange calm rose in my chest, not the soft kind that follows acceptance. This was the quiet that comes before a correction, the kind of quiet you learn to trust when you have spent a lifetime being pushed aside politely. Slowly, I stood up and walked to the kitchen. My slippers made no sound on the hardwood. I opened the cabinet above the stove and reached for the small metal safe I kept tucked behind a stack of recipe books. My hands did not shake as I entered the code. The door clicked open and the soft light inside revealed a ring of keys labeled with tags. Properties in Asheville, a duplex in Charlotte, a set for the mountain rentals, and next to them a small flash drive in a protective case. My entire portfolio lived inside that drive. High-value stocks, municipal bonds, 34 rental properties, a percentage stake in a regional bank, impact fund positions spread across the Southeast, years of work, years of discipline, years of hiding my real life so Rachel could grow up without feeling the weight of numbers the way I once did. She thought I had retired from a simple bank clerk job. Veronica thought I was a woman who wore discounts and clipped coupons. None of them knew that for nearly 2 decades I ran the underwriting division for a major lender before becoming a quiet consultant for community finance programs. They never cared to ask. I placed the safe on the counter and plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The dashboard opened, a neat grid of balances and assets. My net worth blinked back at me in steady lines of black text, 7 figures in the high range. I looked at it without pride and without shame. It was simply the truth, a truth I had protected and never weaponized, until now. I clicked on a folder marked Carter Lending Agreement February 2023. The digital copy opened and the clauses appeared in clean legal formatting. Payment schedule, collateral terms, default triggers, transfer of ownership upon breach. My finger traced the date. 6 months had passed last week. Even if I never lifted another finger, the contract was already enforceable. Veronica did not know that. Rachel did not know that. They believed my help was a gift. They believed generosity was the same as weakness. They believed I would swallow any humiliation for the sake of being included in their new family mold, not family. If that was the boundary they wanted, I could honor it fully. Gifts are kept inside families. Business, however, follows rules. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair, letting the truth settle in the quiet kitchen. My heart did not race. There was no fury in my chest, only clarity. If they saw me as an accessory, someone who could be removed from photos and events and memories, then perhaps it was time to let the numbers speak in a way words never had. Before shutting the laptop, I whispered into the stillness of my kitchen. If I am not family, then this is business. And in business, consequences arrive on schedule. If you have ever been pushed aside by your own toxic family, your voice labeled as noise while your sacrifices were taken for granted, tell me in the comments. Sometimes quiet justice is the only justice left. Morning light seeped through the blinds in thin, muted lines as I stood at the kitchen counter stirring my coffee, the steam rising slowly while the words on my phone refused to fade. I read Rachel's latest message again. Veronica says people will judge your divorce and the whole inheritance drama. It is just less embarrassing if you are not there. The sentence wrapped itself around my throat in a quiet squeeze. Embarrassing, that was the word my daughter chose to describe me after everything I had poured into her life. And she said it so casually that it told me this was not a sudden thought, but something she and her mother-in-law had discussed enough times for the language to stick. I stood still, absorbing the familiar ache of being reduced to a flaw in her curated world, the part she hoped no one asked about, the part she wished she could edit out like a stain in a photograph. I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. The house around me felt steady and calm, which only made her message feel colder, as if the insult had been delivered into a sanctuary that no longer belonged to me. My phone rested on the counter, and I tried to breathe through the tightening in my chest. But the past always finds its way in when the present hits. Hard memory flickered like an old film, and suddenly I was back in that cramped kitchen in Hendersonville, where I once lived with Tom Hale, a man who never lifted a hand to me, but wielded his voice like a blade sharpened on resentment. He had called me his walking wallet. Whenever he wanted to remind me of my place, he emptied the college fund I spent years building for Rachel and used it to chase business ideas that always fell apart. And when I cried, he muttered that numbers were all I was good for anyway. It took me years to understand that emotional bruises may not show on skin, but they shape your spine and teach you how to stand without leaning on anyone. The day I left him, I promised myself I would never let chaos own me again. I threw myself into work at a level that frightened even my colleagues. I became the underwriter they sent the impossible cases to, because I could dissect a loan application the way a surgeon studies a scan. I rose quietly through the ranks and became a senior advisor for one of the largest lenders in Charlotte. No one saw the hours of study, the certifications, the meticulous attention to risk structures. They only saw a woman who rarely spoke unless she had something worth hearing. After the divorce, I used every skill I had to rebuild in silence, while Rachel believed I lived a simple life. I spent weekends touring foreclosed properties, running numbers in my head. Faster than agents could flip through paperwork, I bought small homes and renovated them, turned duplexes into rental units. Every property paid for the next one. Like clockwork, it became a private rhythm of survival and purpose. My portfolio grew quietly. 34 rental homes spread across 3 counties, several high-performing stocks, municipal bonds, impact funds aimed at rebuilding communities that banks ignored. I was never loud about my wins, and Rachel never asked. She thought I was a retired clerk who lived modestly, and Veronica assumed I was someone who shopped bargains for sport. Neither of them understood that some of us learned early in life that financial order is a form of emotional armor. I kept stirring my coffee while my mind circled back to the message that called my entire life. Embarrassing, the irony rested heavy in my chest. As my phone began buzzing on the table, I answered without looking at the name, because only one person called that early from a corporate line. The voice on the other end was warm and familiar. "Marjorie, this is David from the credit committee. I need your take on a pending loan review." He hesitated before adding, "It is for Carter Digital and Events." The business under Luke's name, the file pulled up on his screen, and I could hear the shuffle of paper and the gentle hum of office equipment in the background. I leaned against the counter, letting his words settle, seeing both Rachel and Veronica listed as guarantors, their names tied to terms. They probably had not fully read their financial fingerprints spread across a document they believed no one important would ever see for a moment. I simply listened to the quiet between us. Then I said, "Approve it and make sure every clause is airtight." My voice did not shake. I made the decision months ago before betrayal had a name, before they stepped on the very hands holding them up. Back then I thought I was helping them build stability, but now I saw how easily generosity can be swallowed, whole by entitlement. David thanked me and hung up, and for a moment the house felt too silent again. The morning had not even fully begun yet. The weight of the day felt settled. I reached for my laptop because moving was easier than thinking, and I opened the financial dashboard to scan the monthly support transfer I always scheduled for Rachel, a habit born from the years after the divorce, when I wanted to ensure she never felt the financial instability I once lived through. I looked at the recurring amount, and something inside me clicked into place. Not anger, not spite, just a quiet realignment of boundaries, long overdue. I opened the trust management page and shifted the monthly support into a protected account under my name, only no cancellation notice, no explanation, just silent correction. A small act of conflict justice tucked neatly inside a morning routine. Rachel would notice eventually, but by then I would not owe her an apology for choosing myself. I closed the laptop and stood still as the sunlight continued to stretch across the kitchen. I thought about how Veronica treated my presence like clutter and how Rachel absorbed her tone. Without question, I realized that they saw me as an ATM mother, convenient, quiet, dispensable. They underestimated who I was and what I carried, because I never asked for credit or praise, but numbers do not lie, and neither does dignity. And as I poured another small splash of cream into my coffee, I whispered to no one in particular, underestimation can be its own kind of fuel in a toxic family where betrayal grows easily. Sometimes the only way forward is through quiet justice that rises slowly until the moment it is impossible to ignore. Thanksgiving of 2018 arrived with the kind of crisp Asheville air that usually made me feel grounded and steady. Yet that morning, I felt a faint tension beneath my ribs as I set the table and listened to the slow simmer of the gravy on the stove. The house smelled of roasted herbs and warm bread and the familiar comfort of a holiday I had always hosted with pride. But the moment Veronica stepped through my doorway in her tailored coat and pointed boots, her eyes swept across my living room with the expression of someone reviewing a vacation rental she had not chosen. She paused at the kitchen threshold and let her gaze fall on my older refrigerator, a reliable appliance that had been with me longer than her marriage to Luke had existed, and she smiled with a polite sweetness that felt sharpened at the edges and said, "It is charming. Luke grew up with Sub-Zero, so this is like a little time travel." Her voice floated across the kitchen like perfume meant to impress strangers. I felt Rachel stiffen beside her, but she did not correct or defend. She only tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and attempted a small laugh that never reached her eyes. I welcomed them inside anyway because hosting had always been my role, and I had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones who speak the least during the meal. Veronica positioned herself at the end of the table as if she owned the place, and for a few moments she behaved as though she were genuinely considering the flavors of the dishes I prepared. Then her tone shifted. The moment conversation lightened. She tapped her fork against the plate and announced, "When we plan the real wedding, we will make sure people see that Luke did not marry down." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and everyone heard the ripple. Rachel offered a tight, apologetic smile, yet remained silent, and Luke looked down at his plate, pretending not to notice the discomfort around him. I felt the insult land squarely in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral, because silence can be a shield and a weapon all at once. I passed the cranberry sauce with steady hands and offered a calm nod as though her words meant nothing, though they carved a familiar ache through my ribs. The first real drop in any betrayal comes not when the wound is new, but when it is delivered in front of witnesses and left unchallenged by the very people you raised as the meal continued. Veronica shifted the conversation toward her newest purchase, a beach house she described with dramatic sighs. She complained about the mortgage as if it were an inconvenience meant only for those who lack taste or connections. And when she mentioned the lender by name, my mind sharpened without showing any sign on my face. I recognized the bank immediately and the type of loan she described, and the realization slid into me with cold clarity. Her mortgage was inside a portfolio held by the investment group. I advised the very same group whose financial decisions often crossed my desk before they reached public documentation. Veronica was walking around complaining about debt that funneled through a system I helped manage. She had no idea she was living inside a structure, partially supported by my quiet authority, and that knowledge rested in my mind like a card waiting to be played at the right moment. I made no comment as she continued complaining. I only nodded while taking a slow sip of water and tucking the thought away. The meal moved into dessert, and I retrieved a bottle of wine from the cabinet, a bottle I rarely touched. It was left to me after the divorce, one of the few tokens of Tom's pretentious collection, and I had saved it not for sentimental reasons, but because I always knew that moments of truth have a way of finding the right table. I opened it with practiced ease and poured for everyone, including Veronica, who took a sip and raised her brows in visible delight. "This wine is surprisingly good," she said, and I smiled just enough for her to see the curve of my mouth as I answered, "Yes, I paid for it with my embarrassing divorce settlement." The silence that followed was brief but potent, and for a few seconds no one spoke. Even Rachel looked startled, though she quickly lowered her gaze. It was only a small jab, but it landed exactly where it needed to. Not to wound deeply, but to remind everyone that I carried more history and strength than they preferred to remember. The rest of the evening unfolded in polite fragments until it was time for family photos. I stood near the fireplace adjusting my sweater while Rachel and Luke positioned themselves in the center. Veronica guided people around as if she were arranging a showroom display, and she placed her hand lightly on my arm as she guided me to the far side of the frame. It happened so subtly that someone watching might have believed it was accidental, but I recognized the choreography. By the time the shutter clicked, I was nearly out of the picture, and the smile on Veronica's face suggested she considered the placement perfect. Later that night, long after I had washed the dishes and folded the napkins, I opened my laptop to unwind and saw Rachel had posted the photo. The editing was unmistakable. My shoulder was cropped away and the caption read, "My beautiful family." I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of invisibility settle again in my bones. It was one thing to be humiliated in person, but being erased publicly carried a different sting. It was the kind of betrayal that sinks into you, quietly reminding you that no matter how much you provide or care, there are people who will choose to remove you from the frame entirely. I sat there in the dim light of my living room, letting the feeling pass through me without letting it consume me. I reminded myself that I had survived far worse. In the years before Rachel was grown, I had endured a toxic family atmosphere of my own, before building a life anchored in discipline rather than chaos, and I knew enough about human nature and money to understand that betrayal often reveals itself before it becomes undeniable. I closed the laptop gently and let the silence settle again, thinking about how sometimes revenge inheritance drama does not begin with grand confrontations, but with small cuts delivered from people who smile while holding the blade. I took a slow breath and whispered to myself that family betrayal has a way of repeating in cycles unless someone breaks it. I was beginning to understand that the cycle in my life was about to turn in a direction they did not expect, and betrayal family karma has a way of balancing its own books even when no one sees the ledger. In the weeks that followed that Thanksgiving photo where I had been quietly trimmed from the edges like an unnecessary decoration, the rhythm of my days shifted because instead of the expected calm after a holiday, there came a steady stream of requests that felt less like family communication and more like automated alerts from a system that saw me only as a source of funding. The first call arrived early on a Tuesday morning when Rachel's voice shook with excitement about a new marketing push for their business, and she said they just needed a small boost to launch a new campaign that Veronica insisted would change everything. I listened while standing by the window, watching the winter sun climb the Blue Ridge, and although part of me wanted to say no, the part of me that still remembered Rachel as a child with scraped knees and soft apologies pressed through, and I wired 80,000 without making her explain further, because mothers are trained to respond to urgency with action. 2 weeks later, Luke emailed a pitch deck that was polished and dramatic, full of projections and color-coded growth charts. He addressed me as their angel investor and thanked me for believing in them. Even though his gratitude existed only in writing, I knew that in front of Veronica he was telling a very different story about who had saved their business. And slowly I realized that I was becoming a character in two parallel narratives. In one story, I was the quiet benefactor, and in the other, I was conveniently erased. Like I had been from that Thanksgiving photo, the requests continued with increasing boldness and diminishing explanation, until one afternoon Rachel called from the parking lot of a clinic, her voice trembling as she told me she had miscarried again, and the medical bills were overwhelming, and she did not know what else to do. I drove to the bank that day without hesitation and paid everything in full, even as a familiar ache pressed against my ribs, because supporting her in pain had always been instinctive, and I did not want her grief tangled with financial fear. But beneath the compassion, there was a slow building pressure, a quiet recognition that I was being pulled into a pattern where love was measured in dollar amounts, and every act of giving only erased me a little further. Veronica played her part smoothly by reassuring Rachel that I liked to feel useful and that I should continue supporting them because real legacies come from building empires, not from saving pennies. She repeated this idea often enough that Rachel began parroting pieces of it, and I could hear the shift in her voice each time she reassured me that I did not need to worry she would pay me back someday, even though she never asked about my finances or my life beyond what I could provide. The escalated twist came unexpectedly when I received a call from a colleague in Charlotte, asking whether I knew I had been listed as a senior banking expert backing Luke's business in their investor deck. I opened the file he forwarded and saw my name in bold type beneath a headline indicating strategic oversight and financial assurance, and there was no mention of debt they owed me, nor the repeated last-minute requests for help, nor the fact that Veronica had openly dismissed my background as embarrassing. It was not just my money they were using. It was my reputation. And in the world of story, financial reputations are currencies more powerful than checks. I felt heat rise in my chest, but instead of reacting, I simply filed the thought away because quiet fury has its own precision. And I had learned over years of conflict justice that timing can be more devastating than confrontation. When one of the potential investors called me directly to verify the claims in the deck, I kept my voice even and polite. I told him they were enthusiastic, but they tended to overextend themselves, and he should be sure his lawyers read every line with attention. I did not tell him to invest, nor did I tell him not to. I only placed a pebble in the stream and let the current move naturally. The next day, Rachel called crying because the investor had suddenly withdrawn interest, and Luke was storming around the apartment, accusing her of sabotaging the deal. She asked whether I had said anything damaging, and I told her calmly that I had only told the truth. Silence stretched for a long moment before she whispered that Luke thought I did not support them and that Veronica said I was being controlling again. I ended the call feeling the familiar sting of family betrayal, but also a strange sense of clarity because their blame revealed more about their guilt than my actions ever could. The brunch that followed became another turning point because Veronica invited her wealthier friends and relatives to a private dining room in a hotel overlooking downtown. Charlotte and I arrived dressed neatly, though not extravagantly because I had no interest in performing wealth the way she did. I was barely seated before she began describing their business as our family business, and she used we with exaggerated casualness while skipping over every contribution I had made. She introduced me to others as someone who had been kind enough to help here and there, and then shifted the spotlight to Luke and herself, saying they had built everything from the ground up and that entrepreneurship was in their blood. Every time the conversation crested toward financial strategy or credit management, she redirected questions toward herself, even though her understanding was surface level and full of overconfident misinterpretations, and each time she dismissed my quiet corrections with a condescending smile. At one point, an older woman asked how they had managed to scale so quickly, and Veronica replied with a laugh that Luke had the vision and she had the family connections, and that some people contributed by simply being supportive from the sidelines, which in her language meant irrelevant yet available. I felt the room tilt slightly the way it does when injustice wraps itself around the same bones it always targets, and Rachel sat beside her mother-in-law with her gaze lowered as if she had been rehearsing silence for months. I understood then that this was not accidental disrespect. This was an architecture built slowly and intentionally, a toxic family dynamic reinforced by dependency and ego, where gratitude was optional, but access to my resources was assumed. I finished my brunch, quietly tasting none of the food and observing how easily Veronica performed ownership of things she had not built, and it occurred to me that they saw me only as a financial instrument stripped of identity and emotion. I realized in that moment that the invisible investor they relied on was only invisible because I allowed myself to be, and the day would come when they would learn what happens when you mistake silence for lack of power. And as I left the room filled with their chatter and bright laughter, I carried with me not anger, but the slow building weight of justice, forming its own shape, preparing its own timing, waiting for the moment when the books would finally balance. The shift from irritation to something sharper happened on an ordinary afternoon when Luke called, asking for another transfer, and I finally said no, my voice calm but firm as I told him they needed to pause and reassess their spending. There was a long silence on the line before he exhaled hard and snapped. Then stop acting like our mother and just admit, "You're the bank that is all you have ever been." His words hit me with a force that made my grip on the phone loosen, and for a moment I could not tell whether the sound in my ears was my heartbeat or the echo of an old familiar cruelty. Before I could gather breath, Rachel's voice slipped into the call, soft and unsteady, as she added, "Mom, you know you are better with numbers than emotions. It is just how you are." And the combination of their voices left me suspended in a cold stillness, as though every sacrifice, every night I stayed up helping them, every moment I put their needs above my own, had been reduced to a simple equation that equaled usefulness without affection. It struck directly at something deeper than pride because it touched the part of me that had survived years with Tom, who had once told me I was a walking wallet and nothing more. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that old shadow rise around me again after I hung up. The house felt too quiet, the corners felt too sharp, and I walked to my office where the folders of my life sat lined up with neat labels: Rachel's college fund inheritance from parents, retirement, and I opened each one, slowly letting the memories inside wash over me like cold water, because every page reminded me of what I had protected and what I had lost. And as I sat there in the dim light, I realized I was teetering at the edge of a breaking point. The weight of toxic family patterns pressing down with the same rhythm as years before, when I had lived with emotional violence hidden behind polite doors. I stayed awake through most of the night, replaying their voices, and trying to understand how I had become someone so easy to dismiss someone they could reduce to a financial utility as dawn crept in with its faint blue glow. My phone buzzed with an email invitation for a private meeting with the investment board I occasionally advised, and I attended it later that week, still carrying the exhaustion of that night. The boardroom was quiet, the polished table reflecting the overhead lights, as they explained that they were considering a buyout of Luke's company if certain performance milestones were met, and they wanted my insight to structure the deal. They talked about valuations and equity forecasts, and at one point the chairwoman asked directly whether I believed the business had leadership strong enough to sustain long-term growth, and the implication hovered in the air like smoke, because they were asking me if I would take a role that could eventually put me in control of the entire company, if I chose to accept the offer. I kept my expression steady even as something inside me twisted, because the power they were handing me was not small. It was a quiet path to take over everything Luke and Veronica were building, while they still saw me as irrelevant. I told them I needed time, and I left the meeting with a strange mix of heaviness and clarity. I was not ready to act on that option, but I tucked it away in what I silently called my revenge reserve, knowing that justice often unfolds slowly and with precision. The next turning point came when I met with my lawyer, Denise Morales, to discuss structuring the $500,000 they had requested earlier as an official agreement rather than another emotional bailout. Denise reviewed their financials with a clinical eye and told me the safest structure was a secured loan with their townhouse and a portion of business shares as collateral, and she said this protects you and ensures boundaries, where love has not created any. I hesitated because even after everything, part of me still wanted to believe Rachel would turn back toward me, but Denise looked at me with a soft steadiness and added, "You can love someone deeply and still require a contract, when the pattern is this damaging." I understood because this was not revenge, emotional. This was conflict justice shaped into paper and ink. So I agreed, and we created the agreement quietly, without ceremony, and without telling Rachel that I had protected myself for the first time in years. When I returned home from signing the documents, I felt a strange combination of heartbreak and relief, and I walked straight to my bedroom where my safe sat, tucked beneath the window, and I pulled out the envelope that held my will. I read it slowly, letting the words pass through me. Then I took a pen and revised the beneficiary list, removing Veronica and Luke entirely, and redirecting a significant portion of my assets to charities and scholarship funds for women leaving abusive marriages. Because if my story had taught me anything, it was that inheritance drama means nothing if it only feeds the same toxic family cycle. This was a quiet act, a small personal revenge that they would not discover until much later, but it grounded me. It reminded me that I had agency, and that the life I built through years of discipline would not be handed to people who weaponized my generosity. When I closed the safe again, I felt the room settle around me with a different kind of silence. Not the emptiness of being used, but the beginning of reclaiming something I had forgotten. And for the first time in months, the tightness in my chest loosened because I was no longer waiting for them to value me. I was preparing to value myself. The morning we arranged to sign the loan agreement arrived with an unsettling calm, and I drove to their townhouse in Charlotte, feeling as though I were carrying a secret map. No one else in that house had bothered to read. The papers were stacked neatly on the dining table when I walked in, and sunlight from the tall windows spilled across them like a spotlight on a scene none of them realized they were performing. Veronica was pacing near the kitchen island with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking sharply to a florist about centerpieces and delivery windows, and she waved at me without breaking her conversation, barely glancing at the documents as if they were nothing more than household receipts. Luke arrived next, holding a cup of iced coffee, and greeted me like I was the helpful accountant who stopped by occasionally, rather than the person who had just underwritten the survival of his business and personal life. He sat down casually and skimmed the first page before laughing to Rachel and saying, "It is just Mom's way to feel in control, sign it so she can stop worrying." The way he said Mom scraped something inside me because it was filled with the same detachment he used When thanking the dry cleaner for ironing his shirts, Rachel smiled nervously and took her pen. And while she hesitated for a second, I saw the flicker of something uncertain cross her face before she quickly brushed it away as if hesitation itself were impolite. She signed without reading a single clause, and the sound of her pen scratching across the page felt louder than it should have. I stood there, watching each of them sign the contract that would later become the center of their unraveling, and none of them realized this was the moment they stepped fully into the structure they had built with neglect and entitlement. I felt no triumph, then only a quiet ache mixed with an awareness that justice was already in motion. Veronica finally returned from her call and flicked through the pages quickly, her perfectly manicured finger sliding over the lines without grasping anything, and she said something about trusting family and not needing to waste time on boring details as she signed her name with dramatic flair. The ink barely dried when she turned her attention back to discussing floral arches and champagne fountains, as if money existed in endless wells and responsibility was someone else's burden when everything was completed. I collected the remaining pages and placed them back in my folder, feeling the weight of both their signatures and the years of choices that had led to this point that afternoon. Denise sent digital copies to the title company and county records, and within an hour my phone rang. A clerk I recognized from previous filings greeted me politely and confirmed the documents had been recorded, but then she paused and said almost offhandedly, "We do not usually see someone with your portfolio take only 40%. You could have taken the whole thing if you wanted." I stood still in the parking lot, hearing her words settle around me. I thanked her and ended the call, while a faint wind moved through the trees overhead. It was a moment that revealed more about my standing than I had ever shared with Rachel or anyone else in that circle, because the truth was, I could have leveraged far more, but I had chosen restraint. The comment hinted at something larger to the audience of this story, that my financial reach was considerably wider than the narrow role I had been reduced to by people who used me without ever understanding the depth of what they were drawing from. Driving home, I made a small detour, stopping at the bank. Veronica used a place decorated with marble counters and cold-scented air designed to feel luxurious. I walked up to the teller and asked to transfer a substantial certificate of deposit into an institution I advised, and when she looked up my name, her face changed instantly because she recognized it from major files and advisory portfolios, and she spoke to me with a deference Veronica had never imagined I commanded. When I left the branch, I felt a subtle shift inside me, not pride but steadiness, because this was a reminder that I moved through a financial world that respected my experience and influence, even though Veronica treated me as if I were merely an older woman lucky to be included in her orbit. As wedding preparations intensified, Veronica sent out an email containing the seating chart for the reception, and my name sat at table 12 near the restrooms, alongside distant cousins and a couple she once described as people she only invited so the guest count would look respectable. I stared at the tiny digital grid and felt the familiar sting of being pushed to the outer edge again, as if I existed only in their periphery, not just financially, but physically and symbolically. Later, I saw the group chat Rachel shared with Veronica and Luke, where Veronica typed, "We cannot put her up front. People will ask where Luke's real family is." The phrase, "real family," clung to me like damp fabric because it suggested I was merely an obligation they could tuck away out of sight once my usefulness was exhausted, and still Rachel did not object, did not defend, did not even attempt to soften the blow. She simply reacted with a small, awkward emoji, followed by a heart as if that somehow comforted or excused the exclusion. I read the message twice, letting it wash through me without drowning me, because by now I recognized the pattern fully. They assumed I would remain silent and pliant forever, even as they continued shaping their world with my resources. They mistook my quietness for weakness, and my generosity for lack of boundaries, and they believed their vision of family was the only one that mattered yet, Every slight, every dismissal, every push toward the edges of the frame was slowly building toward a moment they could not anticipate. Because while they prepared flowers and photo backdrops and seating charts that excluded me, I was preparing something different, something that had been carefully structured through documents and timing and conflict justice that did not require revenge, emotional, or cruelty. Simply truth presented at the exact moment it would reveal everything they had refused to see. And as I sat that evening with the seating chart glowing faintly on my phone screen, I felt no rage, only an almost painful clarity, the kind that comes when the story is nearing its turn, and the people who dismissed you are already walking toward the consequences they created without reading a single line of the agreement that would soon define their future. The night the final message arrived felt like a continuation of the first fracture months, earlier yet sharper, because now every part of the pattern had revealed itself fully. And when my phone lit up again at 1:06 in the morning, with Rachel's name glowing against the dark, I already sensed the blow forming before I opened the screen. Her text appeared in a string of pale sentences that looked almost fragile in the darkness, yet carried the weight of every toxic family wound that had ever been sharpened against me. And she wrote, "Veronica says it is better this way. She does not want awkwardness with your divorce, your background." That last word, background, lingered in my mind like a slow spreading bruise, because it was not just a reference to my past, it was a quiet class insult, the kind spoken by people who believe their polished surfaces make them superior. And for a moment, I stared at the message, wondering how many times Veronica had used that same word in private shaping. Rachel's view of me, without Rachel even recognizing she had adopted someone else's disdain. I answered nothing at first, letting the silence stretch between us because silence had become the only language they seemed to understand. Before I could set the phone aside, it buzzed again, and the next message came with an ease that told me it had been rehearsed, or at least justified in Rachel's mind. She wrote, "You have already done enough financially, that is what matters. Presence is just symbolic." I read it once, then again, and the implication became clear. As Crystal, she did not simply want me absent. She believed my role in her life had never extended beyond the reach of my bank transfers. I had been officially reduced to an ATM mother, a presence replaced by dollars, and a woman whose face did not need to appear at her own daughter's wedding, because the money had already stood in for me. There was no further negotiation after that because the small remaining thread that held me to hope snapped cleanly, and the quietness inside me shifted from hurt into something still and resolved and purposeful. I stood from the bed, walked toward my desk, and pulled out the calendar, where every important date had been carefully noted, and I let my finger trace the timeline leading back to the contract we had signed 6 months earlier. The one they never bothered to read, it had now surpassed the required period, and that meant the trigger clause was active. I took one slow breath, then dialed Denise, my voice steady as I told her, "Serve them at the wedding." I heard her brief pause through the line, not hesitation exactly, but surprise, because even she could feel the gravity of what this moment meant. And she asked if I was certain, and I said yes. They insisted I should not be there, and I will not be, but my absence will not protect them from the truth. Denise promised she would arrange a courier to deliver the documents at the reception itself, ensuring the clause would unfold in front of the very people Veronica had curated so carefully. As soon as we ended the call, I sat quietly in the dark, letting the weight of the decision settle into my bones, and it felt neither vengeful nor cruel. It felt necessary, like correcting an unbalanced ledger. The next morning after making coffee, I called the owner of the catering company. Veronica had hired a woman I had known for years, someone whose business I had once discreetly saved with a bridge loan. During a slow season, she greeted me warmly, and I asked her to listen carefully as I explained that if any Carter check bounced for the event, she was not to extend credit. Instead, she should bill me directly and we would settle matters privately. She understood immediately and thanked me quietly, knowing what this setup implied, and that small protective act felt like a precise form of quiet justice, ensuring Veronica would face the real consequences of her choices rather than disguising them with charm. Later that afternoon, I opened my closet and pulled down the suitcase I had not used in months, the one with a small scuff on the corner from a trip long before any of this began, and I laid it open on the bed, placing inside only what mattered: my laptop, my USB portfolio, the thick folder containing every contract and record, and the clothes I would need for a few days, because I had already booked a seat on the morning train to Richmond. The same morning, my daughter would walk down an aisle without me packing. Felt strangely calm, not heavy, because I was not running away from anything. I was moving toward a truth that had finally revealed its shape. And as I zipped the bag, I felt a clarity settle into me like the quiet after a long storm. I looked around my bedroom, the soft lamplight casting warm shadows, and I thought, this time I will not stand in the back of a room waiting to be acknowledged. This time I will not be invisible. This time I will not absorb the humiliation they choose to hand me. I will not be present in that country club or in their curated photos or in the polite stories they tell about supportive family members who help from afar. I will be gone physically, but what I signed, what they ignored, will arrive in my place, and the truth they dismissed will stand where I was told not to stand. As I folded the last shirt, I whispered to myself, I will not be there, only the truth will, and the truth will not apologize. I closed the suitcase quietly and set it by the door, feeling almost weightless, because the hardest part had already happened the moment I let go of wanting them to understand me, and finally chose to understand myself. And in that understanding, the path forward became simple, clear, and inevitable. The first real step of revenge story, money shaped not by hatred, but by the quiet power of consequences they created, with every dismissal, every insult, every instance of family betrayal they believed would go unanswered. The morning of the wedding, I stepped onto the train to Richmond with my suitcase in one hand and my phone in the other, and as the carriage hummed to life, I opened my banking app more out of habit than worry, and saw the notification I had been waiting for: a small line of text that read, "Lien transfer in progress." It blinked calmly up at me while passengers shuffled past. Finding their seats, sunlight slid across the window, casting long streaks over the aisle. And for a brief moment, I watched my own reflection layered over the numbers, a woman who had been told she was not family, watching the quiet machinery of Story Financial move forward on her behalf, while the train pulled away from the station, carrying me north the country club in Charlotte, filled with guests dressed in polished fabrics and carefully chosen jewelry, and Veronica moved through that world as if she were the central figure. She greeted people with air kisses and sweeping gestures, calling this day a celebration of legacy and love, and ignoring the tension that pulsed beneath the surface like a faint drum. She spoke loudly about the Carter family name and their long-standing presence in the community, about how Luke had always been destined for leadership, and how Rachel had finally found her rightful place inside a real family. The phrase, "real family," floated above the tables like scented smoke, while servers refilled champagne flutes and photographers moved discreetly through the crowd, capturing every curated moment on the train. I took a slow breath and closed the app, letting the seat cradle my body as we curved along the tracks. I imagined the white tent Veronica had described with such pride, chandeliers hanging from beams draped in fabric, a dance floor polished to a mirrored shine, floral arrangements towering over each table, all funded in part by money she pretended came from nowhere. In the reception tent, the band played soft jazz while people lingered near the bar, and the chatter swelled. At one point, an older relative leaned toward another and asked in a voice just low enough to imply discretion, "Where is her mother anyway?" I heard later that Veronica smiled with controlled patience and answered, "Some people are better supporting quietly from afar," as if my absence were a gracious choice instead of an enforced erasure, as if I were some distant sponsor who did not belong among these polished guests. I sat back against the train seat feeling none of the panic they might have expected. Instead, there was only a deep, cool certainty that the story they were telling was about to split open. Sometime after the first round of toasts, Veronica rose to give her speech. She lifted her glass and smiled at the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to her. We all know Rachel had a difficult upbringing, she began, letting the word difficult stretch just enough to suggest more than it said. But we are proud. She is now truly a Carter. The implication that my life and our years together were little more than a hardship. She had escaped, slid through the tent like a blade wrapped in lace. Guests murmured softly, nodding without understanding. And Rachel smiled weakly, as if unsure whether to be grateful or ashamed. At the same time, I watched trees blur past outside my window and felt the gentle sway of the carriage. The distance between us measured not only in miles, but in truths. They had refused to see then, as the band prepared to start another song. And the noise in the tent settled into a pleasant buzz. A man in a simple dark suit stepped through the entrance carrying a plain envelope. He was not part of the staff, and his presence created a slight ripple as he crossed the floor, scanning the crowd. He stopped near the head table and spoke in a firm, steady voice that cut through the music. Delivery for Luke and Veronica Carter. Some guests glanced toward the tent opening, expecting a surprise gift or elaborate gesture. Luke accepted the envelope with a half-amused, half-curious expression and said probably from one of our vendors as he slid a finger under the seal. Veronica leaned closer, wine glass poised at her lips, ready to perform delight for whatever attention this new moment might bring. But as the first page unfolded, the color drained from Luke's face, his smile collapsed, and his eyes darted across the lines with growing disbelief. Veronica reached out and snatched the papers from his hand, scanning them with increasing urgency, each line marked with legal clarity and a notary seal. The room seemed to hold its breath as time stretched thin. "What is this?" she whispered, but her voice carried enough for those nearest to hear the document stated in unmistakable language that they were in default on a $500,000 loan, that the period for repayment had passed without fulfillment, and that per the agreement executed 6 months earlier, 40% of their townhouse and a defined portion of shares in their business were transferring immediately to Marjorie Hale. My name printed clearly alongside Denise's, as legal counsel. The effect moved through the tent like a wave. An investor seated near the bar looked down at his phone. At that exact moment, as an email alert appeared, confirming the updated ownership status of Carter Digital and Events. He blinked and then looked up at Luke with a mixture of shock and something like respect. Because while they had presented themselves as independent success stories, the truth that an older woman they had dismissed had been the real spine of their operation was now undeniable. Inside the envelope, another page bore a brief note from Denise written in concise legal language that future communications regarding financial matters were to be directed solely to my counsel, and that no additional extensions of personal assistance would be considered. In other words, the endless line of requests and emotional leveraging that had defined our relationship had reached its final stop. They could no longer call me at midnight or send frantic texts asking for just one more transfer to save them from their own choices. The road of quiet exploitation had been closed. Guests began whispering. A woman near the cake table leaned toward her husband and said, "Wait, she funded all this." Another guest whispered that he recognized my name as a significant donor to the local women's shelter and a board member for a community finance initiative. Bits of my real life surfaced in small pockets of conversation, like pieces of a photograph emerging in developing solution. The image they had crafted of me as an embarrassing divorced woman with a modest background began to disintegrate right there under the fairy lights. Veronica stood frozen, her hand trembling so violently that red wine sloshed over the rim of her glass and spilled down the front of her expensive dress, a stain spreading across the fabric as if marking the exact moment her control shattered. Rachel stared at the pages in her mother-in-law's grip, her cheeks flushing as she read my name, the loan amount. The terms she had signed without a second thought. The collision of her decisions and their consequences hit her like a physical force, and she stumbled back from the table. A small, strangled sound escaping her before she turned and ran from the tent. The band had stopped playing. Servers stood motionless, holding trays mid-air, while cameras that just moments earlier captured posed joy, now recorded raw confusion. Betrayal family karma had stepped onto the dance floor dressed in paperwork and timing and conflict justice rather than raised voices, and while they faced the wreckage of their assumptions under the scrutiny of their chosen audience, I sat on a moving train, miles away, my hand resting lightly on the window, feeling only a deep, steady calm because this was not revenge for the sake of pain. This was the truth, arriving exactly when it needed to be seen. The aftermath unfolded with a speed and precision that almost felt surreal because, while I rode the quiet stretch of track between small Virginia towns, the consequences of their choices began cascading through their world like a sequence of falling dominoes. The first sign came in the form of an investor withdrawing his commitment, less than 24 hours after the wedding. He sent a brief message to Luke citing concerns about structural instability and risk exposure. And that single decision set off a chain reaction as other investors reviewed their own positions and realized the financial scaffolding holding Carter Digital in events was far weaker than they had believed. One by one, they began stepping back, pulling credit lines and postponing negotiations. Meanwhile, the primary bank handling their accounts initiated a routine but comprehensive review the moment the ownership transfer appeared in the system, because sudden shifts in collateral always trigger deeper audits. And within days, the bank flagged several outstanding loans connected to their operating expenses, equipment, financing, and event contracts. Penalties were assessed, interest rates recalculated, and for the first time since Veronica began flaunting her curated world, she found herself staring at numbers she did not understand, and ratios she had pretended did not apply to families like hers. The beach house she bragged about during Thanksgiving became the brightest red mark on the review with her debt-to-income ratio, jumping high enough that the property slipped into the category considered at risk for early-stage foreclosure. The bank scheduled a follow-up review and sent a polite notice that made her hands shake, according to someone who witnessed her reaction at the club. The irony did not escape me, because she had once mocked my older refrigerator, calling it charmingly outdated. Yet now, her luxury appliances sat inside a house she no longer fully controlled, while their financial world trembled. The investment board requested another meeting with me this time, not to seek my advice, but to make a proposal. They wanted to offer me the chance to buy a majority stake in the Carter business at a significant discount due to the instability. And they presented the offer with an energy that suggested they believed it would appeal to me now, that the truth had surfaced. They spoke about my understanding of the market, my existing influence in community finance, and the natural transition that would occur if I stepped in as the stabilizing force. I listened quietly, allowing their words to settle, then declined with a calm certainty, because I had no desire to control what had been built on entitlement and emotional manipulation. Instead, I asked only that they refrain from injecting further capital, let the numbers speak, and let the consequences unfold, because sometimes karma does not need intervention. It simply needs space to breathe. And when you remove the false supports, the structure reveals its own weakness. After that meeting, I returned home and made a small, everyday decision, one that felt almost insignificant compared to everything else, yet carried its own quiet satisfaction. I opened the account settings for the subscriptions I'd been covering for Rachel for years. The phone plan, the streaming platforms, the little conveniences she had come to assume were her rights rather than my gifts, and I canceled each one with a few simple taps. The next morning, I knew she discovered it because a flurry of messages came in, demanding to know why her phone service had shifted tiers and why the Netflix login no longer worked. And there was a peculiar relief in seeing her startled disbelief because it showed just how deeply she had taken my contributions. For granted, it was a tiny revenge, emotional but sharp enough to remind her that the well she kept drawing from was not bottomless. While she scrambled, I reviewed my own financial dashboard, something I rarely showed anyone, and the full picture of who I truly was emerged with startling clarity. The rental properties spread across several counties, producing consistent income. The blue-chip portfolio quietly compounding over decades, the small business loans repaid with interest, strengthening my reserves, and the impact investments supporting shelters and scholarship funds for women seeking escape from toxic family environments. It was a landscape of stability, strategy, and purpose built through years of decisions made while I lived in the shadow of people who assumed I was small. Seeing that panorama laid out before me created a stark contrast between the person Veronica called an embarrassing divorced woman and the reality of the woman who had shaped her life with discipline rather than performance. Late in the afternoon, Rachel finally called, not with dignity but with panic, her voice cracking as she accused me of ruining her life. She said the investors blamed her, the bank was questioning everything, and Veronica was furious. She cried that I had embarrassed them publicly and destroyed everything they had worked for, and every sentence she threw at me revealed just how deeply she believed I existed, only to absorb the consequences of her mistakes. I let her speak until she ran out of breath, then answered with a calmness that came from the deepest part of me. I did not ruin your life. I told her slowly. I just stopped quietly funding your bad decisions. The silence that followed felt like a door closing a soft but irreversible shift. I heard her inhale shakily, as if she were finally beginning to see the shape of the truth and the difference between support and exploitation, and how quickly a toxic family pattern collapses when the person holding it up steps away. And while she grappled with the truth, the weight of betrayal, family karma settled fully. Not as vengeance, but as a long, overdue reckoning unfolding exactly as it needed to. And for the first time in years, I felt myself standing on solid ground, untouched by their chaos. The knock on my door came 3 days after Rachel's panicked call, and although I had expected someone to show up eventually, I did not expect to see Veronica standing on my porch in a stiff linen dress and oversized sunglasses that failed to hide how strained her expression had become. She tried to smile with the polite graciousness she used at fundraisers, but the edges trembled as she said she hoped I had a moment because we needed to have an adult conversation. I stepped aside out of courtesy, not invitation, and she walked into my living room looking around as if assessing a space she had once dismissed and now suddenly found intimidating. She sat delicately on the edge of the armchair and folded her hands as if she were presenting a thoughtful petition instead of salvaging the wreckage of choices she had orchestrated. She started by thanking me for being generous over the years, and then shifted into apologies wrapped in self-preservation, saying she understood why I had acted so abruptly, but the public nature of the fallout had created unnecessary chatter among people in their circle. And she said, "People are talking. This revenge story, money of yours, has gone too far." I let the words hang in the room for a long moment, letting them expose the delusion that had guided her for so long. Then I answered quietly, "This is not revenge. It is accounting justice without hate." The truth of that statement made her blink because for the first time she recognized that I was not playing her game of image and emotion, but operating from a place she could neither manipulate nor charm. She shifted uncomfortably, then made her escalated offer, lowering her voice as though performing discretion. She said, "If you remove the clause about the townhouse, we can give you a share of the beach house, something meaningful, something that keeps the family reputation intact." I felt a slow, quiet exhale move through me as I said, I do not want pieces of a toxic legacy. I just want what I was promised. She stared at me with a mix of confusion and disbelief because she had spent her life around people who would have leapt at the chance to own a slice of her curated world, never understanding that I saw the rot beneath the polish. She stood abruptly smoothing her dress and said she hoped I would reconsider for Rachel's sake for the sake of appearances, but I simply walked her to the door without offering false comfort or second chances. She stepped onto the driveway with her posture tight. Her keys clutched too hard, and when she backed her car out, she hit a deep patch of washed-out gravel that created a shallow rut last winter, and the wheels spun helplessly, splattering dust before settling in a slight dip. She revved the engine and the tires squealed, but the car only rocked forward and back without gaining traction. My neighbor, who had been walking his dog, paused at the sidewalk and called out politely, "You lost ma'am." Veronica stiffened and muttered something about being fine while I stood on the porch, calmly sipping my tea, watching the scene with a stillness she could not decipher. I did not offer to help. I simply lifted my hand in a small, polite wave, the same way she had waved me aside in her world, and after a few more futile attempts, she managed to jerk the car free and drive off, leaving a faint cloud of dust floating behind her. The silence that followed felt almost warm. Later that afternoon, Rachel arrived, her face pale and tight with exhaustion, and when she stepped onto the porch, she looked smaller than I remembered, as though the weight of the past week had drained every inflated certainty she used to carry. She sat without waiting for an invitation, clasping her hands together and staring at the yard as she whispered, "We are not living large anymore. Business has shrunk. We are cutting everything we can, and I do not know what to do." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned to me with eyes brimming, not just with tears, but with disbelief that her life had actually changed. She begged quietly, "Can you just reset everything? Like it never happened. Please, I just wanted to go back." I listened without interrupting because for once, she was speaking without entitlement, and when she finished, I answered with the same clarity I had used with Veronica. I told her I would not undo the contract, I would not erase what had been earned through neglect, and I would not cushion the consequences she had helped create. I explained that if she and Luke needed a place to stay, I would allow them to remain in the townhouse, but they would have to pay rent for the portion I now owned, and that there would be a written lease agreement, no exceptions, no emotional bargaining. She looked stunned, as though she had believed even now I would simply fold back into the pattern they had pressed me into for years, and I said gently but firmly, "If you want me in your life, it cannot be only as free money, it has to be as your mother." She looked away, swallowing hard, and for the first time since this began, I saw a glimmer of recognition in her expression, a dawning awareness of who I truly was beneath the role she had assigned me. The moment lingered heavy but honest, and it marked the beginning of a boundary, long overdue. A quiet justice, forming not out of spite, but out of necessity and dignity, over money. And as she finally nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, I felt something shift between us. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the possibility of a future built on standing up for yourself, reclaiming respect and emotional resilience, rather than on the fragile illusion that love must always come at the cost of self-sacrifice. A full year passed before the pieces of everything finally settled into a shape that resembled something calm and steady and real, and in that year, the edges of their lives softened in ways none of them had expected, because the empire Luke and Rachel once bragged about shrank into something smaller and truer, the kind of business run out of a modest office with a single assistant instead of 3, the kind built on effort instead of image. They no longer traveled for every long weekend or bought new equipment on impulse or threw money at problems, hoping presentation would hide substance. They learned to budget, to plan to live within the boundaries life had handed them, and strangely enough, they became more grounded because of it. Veronica, on the other hand, slipped quietly out of the social tier she had once occupied with the confidence of a queen, because people in that circle have a talent for remembering humiliation that does not touch them, but entertains them. And the story of a mother-in-law banning the woman who paid $500,000 for the wedding and then losing 40% of her own property at the reception spread like whispered wildfire until it became a cautionary tale told, with raised brows and low voices, a lesson that betrayal travels faster than gossip. When delivered in public invitations, she used to receive regularly grew fewer, and when she did attend events, she sensed the shift in the room, the way people paused in conversation, the way they studied her smile, the way they whispered after she passed as though waiting for the next dramatic turn. Meanwhile, I went on with my life in Asheville, tending to my routines, my porch plants, my quiet mornings, and the steady rhythm of my work with the community finance organizations I had supported for years. And one afternoon, Rachel stumbled onto a local magazine left open on the counter at a small cafe while she waited for her to go order. She told me later that she had picked it up absent-mindedly, flipping through pages until a familiar name caught her eye. The article described a quiet benefactor whose consistent contributions had helped expand shelters for women leaving toxic family environments and whose guidance had stabilized several small businesses trying to rebuild after financial hardship. It included a brief mention of my advisory work, my rental properties, my scholarship fund, and none of it was written with drama or self-praise. Only straightforward acknowledgement of years of steady support. Rachel read all of it standing right there in the cafe, and she told me she felt her face grow warm as she realized she had never once asked about the work I did outside the narrow world she lived in. She had never wondered who I was beyond what she needed. The article shifted something in her, not abruptly, but deeply, because she finally saw that the money she had treated like an endless resource had not been drawn from emptiness or obligation, but from a life built on hard work, discipline, and purpose, and the truth that I used my resources to protect people who honored them, not people who exploited them. She told me later it was the first time she understood revenge through truth, that I had not destroyed her world to prove a point. I had simply stopped protecting a world that was hurting me, and that letting the truth walk into that wedding instead of me had been its own kind of healing. Sometime in early autumn, she arrived at my house without calling. First a habit I once resented, but now found strangely comforting because it meant she was not approaching me with demands, only presence. We sat on the porch as the late afternoon light stretched long across the yard, and for the first time in many years, our conversation avoided the topic of money entirely. She sipped her tea quietly before asking in a voice full of hesitation, "Did you ever do all this to punish me?" I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman she had grown into, at the exhaustion and humility and fragile hope in her eyes, and I said softly, "No, I did it so I would not keep punishing myself." She inhaled as though my answer unlocked something in her chest, and she nodded slowly, letting the truth settle between us without argument. We watched the sky dim into shades of gold and rose, and for the first time she leaned her head gently against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small, and the silence between us was not strained but warm. A few weeks later, I received an email from an organization that hosted conferences on family betrayal, financial boundaries, and emotional resilience for middle-aged women. They invited me to speak as a guest presenter, someone who could offer guidance shaped by lived experience rather than theory. And I sat at my desk reading the invitation twice, allowing the weight of it to wash over me, not because of pride, but because it marked the moment my story stopped being just a wound and became something I could use to help other women find their own strength. I accepted the invitation without telling Veronica or Luke, because this next chapter belonged to me alone as the year rounded toward winter. Rachel visited more often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes bringing nothing but conversation and the beginnings of trust. And one evening, as dusk settled across the Blue Ridge, I stepped onto my porch and turned on the old light fixture my husband once installed a lifetime ago. The bulb glowed softly, casting warm gold over the wooden boards, and Rachel stood beside me, watching it flicker to life. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Not talking about the light, but about something larger, something she finally understood, and I smiled, feeling the truth of it rise through me as I answered simply, "It is mine." I was not speaking only of the porch or the house, but of the life I had reclaimed, the dignity I had protected, the self-respect I refused to lose again. And as the evening deepened into quiet, I felt a peace that did not depend on apology or approval, but on quiet justice, silent revenge, and the simple, steady truth that closure does not come from shouting, but from choosing yourself. And if anyone listening carries a story of betrayal or resilience, or standing up for yourself, I hope they find the same light, the kind you switch on with your own hand when you finally decide to reclaim respect and seek truth and closure with dignity over money.